Hello and welcome back to our discussion of the philosophy of love and friendship. It is once again time for us to change time periods, change units, move forward with our discussion. As I've sort of reconsidered and reevaluated the course over the course of several years now, I've kind of quietly in the back of my mind organized it into a few units in order to properly understand, alright, so what am I focusing on? What are the texts that I need to focus on? How do I frame this story of literally thousands of years in the minds of my students? And I will admit right out that this third unit, as we embark upon modernism, might be the most ill-formed of the bunch. It's pretty easy for us to look at the ancient Greek world and sort of just take it apart. To look at the Symposium and the Nicomachean Ethics and see it all as part of one large way of looking at one particular culture's view on love and friendship. And on some level, I wish that we could go into that level of depth with all of the cultures that we bump into along the way, but we very much don't. And then when it comes to Christianity, kind of the key that sort of guides my construction of the Christian unit as we go from the Old Testament to the sort of influence on Stoicism and the Roman Empire, to the discussion of Islam and its influence on the idea of courtly love and how that transforms Christianity in the medieval era, that follows too, and sort of tracks with some of the most important movements and changes to the understanding of love and friendship that take place in the West. You can't talk about love without talking about Christianity, despite the best efforts of my predecessors and certain thinkers on the subject. It's too influential, it's too important, and, to understand our contemporary word love without the context of love your neighbor as yourself is kind of a mess, I think. Yes, we might think of eros first, the way that Plato talks about it and says, when you think of an artist, first you think of, the visual artist. Likewise, when you think of love, obviously you think first of sexual love, but that pretty quickly conflates with the idea of a sort of unconditional love, which is so much a Christian idea. But here, as we approach the modern world, it's a more complicated discussion, and because there's so much going on and so many sources, and we, have many more people with their thoughts to air to the subject, we have to very much narrow our focus, both in space and in time. So on the one hand, the goal of this lecture is to get us up to speed. We have thus far largely followed the story of history with very few gaps from as early as the ancient Greeks all the way through to the end of the medieval era. And while I've skipped over a lot, I tend to think I do a pretty good job of showing us how the whole Western world develops during that time. But we just can't once we hit the modern world. The Renaissance introduces a new era where everything is moving so much faster and there's so much more to talk about, and the individual characteristics of individual nations become so much more important. The whole thing is just impossible to try and keep under, one umbrella of discussion. So as we talk about the modern world, I want us to, instead of trying to get this whole sweep of history thing down, instead I want us to zero in on one particular moment when the ideas of love and friendship are at their most volatile, and when they are changing the most dramatically in accordance with a whole bunch of other changes that are going on at the time. Because as much as love and friendship has a lot of interesting developments over the years between 1500 and the 20th century, not many of them are too easy to register if you're not paying attention super duper closely. We'll get a chance to sort of revisit this stuff when we hit Foucault in a couple of weeks, or in a week if this is the online section. But broadly speaking, it's not terribly noticeable, and honestly, between the 15th and 17th centuries, there's not a lot being said about love and friendship. Again, like we talked about in the medieval era, Greek has come back. People are studying philosophy again, and for reasons that'll become very obvious in a moment, the world is reevaluating these philosophical texts, and in many cases embracing them wholesale, which means we get a lot of stoicism again, if I'm being completely honest. all those thinkers who were sort of rejecting Thomas Aquinas, going back to Plato, very much understood that as being like a move towards Stoicism. So we have readings in our textbook that I've actually taught in the past, readings by Spinoza, readings by Milton, readings by Montaigne, all of which kind of contribute to this, hey, Stoicism's really cool, we should do that again. Like, Montaigne has this absolutely landmark essay on friendship. It's wonderful, one of the most famous things ever written on the subject. And I no longer teach it in this class because it really is just beat for beat Cicero, but with a couple of changes, like small-scale changes. Oftentimes I bring him up in my lectures, but I don't even feel terribly obligated to do that. Like, Montaigne is interesting, but not terribly innovative. His view on friendship is not actually offering anything terribly new to the table that we haven't seen before. And the same is true about many of the thinkers that you might encounter during the Renaissance. Like, Spinoza's a big deal. He changes a lot. He has a very unique view of the world. But his view of love and friendship is basically Stoicism light. Like, okay, passions are bad, so we shouldn't follow them, and instead we should follow rationality. Like, all of this should sound pretty familiar. We've heard this song before. This is clearly just a cover of the same band. Where things really do change, though, is towards the end of this modern era, as we get into the Enlightenment and especially Romanticism. And to have a conversation about the history of love and friendship and not include Romanticism would be as huge an error as having that discussion without talking about Christianity, in my opinion. So we're going to spend a full week looking at Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther and, like, examining how the Romantics understand love and friendship. It's not technically philosophy, but then what is philosophy without literature, without art, without the greater culture going on around it? Like, you kind of have to talk about Romanticism one way or the other, and as much as there are Romantic philosophers, most of them are actually less keyed into Romantic ideas than the philosophers who come afterwards, which we'll talk about in their own time. So, with that in mind, our third unit, as we look at the modern world, is very much going to be focused on the revolutions from the Enlightenment world to the Romantic world and beyond, in especially the late 18th and early 19th centuries. If the study of the Greek culture was a look at one particular culture at one particular moment in history, giving us a deep dive into the culture that very much shaped many of our ideas about love and friendship, if Christianity was an opportunity to look at the big, broad strokes of, cultural development and see how this big idea, this big series of ideas, this huge influential religion shifted and changed over the years as different influences began to change it. Now is our chance to sort of zero in again. We are going to look at what Europe is thinking and doing, especially about love and friendship, in the Enlightenment and through the Romantic Revolution. And we gotta start, and we, gotta, explain how we get there from here in some respect. We have to get us, from the late medieval world that we were talking about, where Christianity was dominant, to explain why suddenly Christianity is not as nearly as important a part of the conversation, and get us to, what is the Enlightenment world, what is their view on love and friendship, how do they understand this, just in time for them to, get absolutely undone by the Romantics and the thinkers beyond. So with that in mind, we got to get to the Enlightenment, is kind of the first goal here. And in order to talk about anything to do with the modern world, we have to start with the printing press. This is a huge deal, the importance of which I cannot overstate. Before the printing press, the ability to write books and disseminate them was extremely limited. We talked briefly about the monasteries in our last lecture on the medieval world. The monasteries, in addition to being centers of learning and places where Christians could live without the temptations of day-to-day life, they were also, as far as the church was concerned, kind of Bible factories. You would, if there was a new parish that needed a Bible, or a Bible needed to be replaced, or they needed to, get a Bible for a local church or something, the priest would go to the monastery and be like, hey, our copy of the Bible is a little long in the tooth, can you make us another one? And it would take a while. It would take months, multiple monks working overtime for, at least a month in order to get a proper Bible out the door. Some of this is because some of these are gorgeous. They're like handwritten, illuminated manuscripts. They're carefully composed. There are all these elaborate artistic techniques that are involved here. And you know, if you ever have the chance to like peruse a medieval Bible, by all means do it. They're freaking gorgeous. But it was a slow process, is what it came down to, and it didn't leave a lot of time for the monks to do the other copying work that they wanted to do. And keep in mind, like, everything that endures to the modern age, every copy of Augustine, every copy of Plato, every copy of Thomas Aquinas, these were all hand-copied by these monks in basically the spare time between all the responsibilities they had to do at the monastery, as well as all their responsibilities like producing Bibles to make sure that everyone could, you know, have access to this thing. And then the printing press happens. And all of a sudden you go from, you can make, you know, maybe 1 or 2 Bibles over the course of 2 to 6 weeks, to we can make 1,000 Bibles in 2 weeks. And even faster as time goes on. Like, by the 16th century, we're producing these things like thousands per week, no problem. And that means that we're talking about a radical change in the way that information is disseminated. Like, people talk about how in the 90s the internet changed everything about the world. This is common knowledge. We are all aware of it. Like, I imagine most of the people listening to this lecture were not aware of this transition. They were born after it had largely taken place. I can tell you, like, as a child of, you know, the late 80s and early 90s, it was wildly transformative. I remember the first time a computer came into my house. I remember the first time I went to a college campus to use the internet. And I remember, you know, 10 years later, this becoming such a normal part of my everyday routine that I carried a laptop around with me to all of my classes. And now we have phones that we just slip into our pockets that can do effectively everything that those devices could do and then some. This is the level of transformation we're talking about. We are going from a world that can get maybe 1 or 2 books out the door in a month to a world where people can come up with some random idea, take it to a printer, and for a relatively low price get thousands of copies of their ideas disseminated all over the European world. All of a sudden, all of these ideas are getting looked at and examined and questioned and built upon by any number of other people who are literate and able to read. And because books are more accessible, more people are becoming able to read. There is a greater desire for people in the middle class, for, you know, merchants and like workers of all stripes, to learn how to read in order to take advantage of this, in order to keep their own books, in order to maintain their financial standing, in order to be able to write and send correspondence to their, you know, mutual like acquaintances and trading partners. Everyone is reading because books are more available. Everyone is learning because books are teaching us things. It is a wild new world of transformative intellectual progress, which very much is what brings about the Renaissance. Like, I imagine the Renaissance is one of those things we actually do know about as students. It is something that still gets covered in, you know, the high school curricula. It is still something that, like, is fairly familiar in popular culture. You know, everyone has been to a Renaissance fair at one point or another, and as much as the historian in me always rankles going to such things, I recognize that, like, hey, at least we know a little bit about what's going on around us, so hooray, that's nice. The Renaissance does mark a move away from the medieval world that we've seen before. In the medieval era, especially in Europe, Christendom was king. The Pope was the most powerful man in the European world. But as a consequence of several historical developments at the late part of the medieval era, specifically like the Pope was basically just hanging out in France, being feted by the French king for a while, which a lot of people thought meant that the Pope could not be trusted, that he was essentially just a French functionary for a while. And then when the Pope finally did move to Italy, France got so upset about it that they made their own Pope, and now all of a sudden there's 2. Oh wait, no, there's 3 popes running around for like 100 years. A lot of faith in the Catholic Church had been squandered in the last couple 100 years. And consequently, Christianity stopped being as influential as it was. Like, everyone was still Christian, everyone still professed Christianity, but increasingly people were starting to ask questions about the Pope and their authority, which will definitely pay off in a moment. But in addition, like, the Renaissance was just an era where, thanks to the printing press, thanks to the more ready availability of information, people were advancing a lot of different disciplines simultaneously. Like, not only does this represent the rebirth, the, return to classical values, though that's a huge part of what's going on here. Like, the architecture of the day was very much deliberately intended to be modeled after the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, with their simplicity, but also with their elegance. Everybody was reading Plato and Aristotle. Like, suddenly philosophy was something that everyone could have access to and everyone wanted to study. But in addition to that, the sort of secondary ideas of Plato and Aristotle, the ideas about the natural world, the ideas about art, the ideas about literature and architecture, these also were becoming current, which is why most people associate the Renaissance with especially artists. Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or Raphael and his Sistine Madonna. Like, these are wonderful paintings that people, clamor to go see, and this is considered one of the most fruitful eras in the history of the visual arts. And largely because these very realistic, very impressive looking paintings were the product of different artists communicating with each other, sending each other their ideas thanks to the printing press, and building on what came before. The entire medieval world has its own sort of distinct art style, which does gradually progress as time goes on and can be, identified to different places throughout the medieval world. But over the course of the Renaissance, you can see within 50 years radical developments. Brunelleschi sort of pioneering the ideas of linear perspective, and then, within 20 years, you've got Da Vinci and Michelangelo perfecting them, and then within another 40 years, you've got folks like Tintoretto sort of, deliberately breaking them for specific effects. It's a fascinating era of artistic development, but we should also stress that it's a fascinating era of scientific and architectural development as well. Brunelleschi, who I just mentioned as being one of the pioneers of linear perspective, was also an architect. He developed this technique of, building over great spaces and, successfully built and designed this dome for the Florence Cathedral that could never have been built with the technology that had existed up to the time. This is how people worked in the Renaissance. Again, they traded their ideas, they built on what came before. Since everyone is literate, they can build on their own ideas and the ideas of others. You can correspond with people who are interested in the same things that you are, and, Europe is a relatively safe place to deliver letters now. So consequently, a lot changes, a lot develops. The Renaissance is justly talked about as this really exciting time in European history, a time of great change, a time of great development, the beginning of the modern era in a very real sense. Now, again, I should stress, a lot of these developments are very much piggybacking on the accomplishments of the Muslim scholars who we talked about last time, and we probably would not have this sort of peace, prosperity, and, openness to all of these new ideas if it wasn't for all of what had come before through the work of Islamic thinkers. But it doesn't change the fact that for Europe, this is a whole new ballgame, and we're going to see some huge developments as a consequence of this. But just as we can advance science and advance technology and advance the frontiers of art, you will find that having the ability to communicate with each other very quickly has its downsides. Just as everyone is really excited about the internet because we can exchange information really quickly and find people who are like-minded with us, so it can also lead to some pretty damaging fights and wars and problems and bad ideas being disseminated as well. Which is not to say that the Protestant Reformation is necessarily a bad idea, but that it is a really influential idea that gets a whole lot of traction really fast because, well, we'll get to it. Again, like I said, Catholicism is kind of on the wane here in the 16th century. A lot of people have lost a lot of faith in the church due to many of its decisions recently, and the church is kind of, panicking and trying to keep up. On the one hand, the church has so much money. I was about to say more money than God, but that's kind of ridiculous since, the church is God, sort of. But at any rate, the church is starting to engage in some pretty greedy practices at the end of the day, including especially this idea of indulgences where you can, pay someone or, make a substantial donation to the church, and all of a sudden, all of your sins are forgiven and you get the fast track to heaven, which this rubs our guy Martin Luther very much the wrong way, and he decides to, pick a fight with some of his friends at the Wittenberg Cathedral. Like, his original plan is probably something along the lines of, I want to have a conversation about this indulgences business. In fact, the church is not listening to this crap anymore. There are several people who have been making some schisms and heresies in the church recently, and this is kind of getting under the church's skin, and they don't want to deal with this crap anymore. So when Martin Luther is like, hey, I've got some problems with this one theological question I have, they're like, and you're excommunicated. Which brings us to the Protestant Reformation, because Martin Luther very much responds by being like, well, fine, I'm going to make my own church, and I'm not going to have a pope, and I don't need any of you losers, I'm going to do it myself. But I want to stress, the Protestant Reformation is kind of complicated here. And this gives me an opportunity to talk about, again, our sort of historiography question for today. Like, was the Protestant Reformation actually motivated by, legit theologians who had beef with the Catholic Church, or was it motivated by selfish jerks who wanted to do things for themselves? I want to stress that this is going to be a kind of common theme throughout the modern world. Like, we're going to bump into this question fairly frequently as we discuss, the era between the 16th century and the 20th. Why, essentially? What are the motivations? Are these people honest, or are they, in fact, doing something selfish? Are they, behaving the way that they do out of some sort of altruistic motive because they want to make the world a better place? Or are they doing it out of some sort of selfish motive because they want to make themselves more powerful, more rich, whatever the case may be? Because as this modern era goes on, there's going to be a lot of question about that sort of thing. Like, here in the Protestant Reformation, it's actually pretty transparent. You can tell pretty much who the honest Protestants are and who the dishonest ones are. So, for example, Martin Luther, all of his correspondence, all of his writings suggest that he really does have some serious beef with the Catholic Church, and that beef is very much rooted in actual problems, that actual, greedy behavior on the part of the Catholic Church. He is honestly trying to make Christendom a better place, make Christians more honest and more faithful to the Bible. He may have some selfish motives behind that, especially as he becomes an influential religious leader. But at the end of the day, his initial motives were, if not good, then honest. Calvin's a bit more of a complicated story. Like, Luther's original principles to, hey, I want to do, church, but I don't want to do it without the Catholic hierarchy, his basic two assumptions are, one, I don't need anyone to tell me how to read my own Bible, thank you very much. Sola Scriptura is the principle that he's using here. Remember that up until this point, virtually nobody is literate. You've got a very small literacy rate in Europe. It's usually just the Catholic Church, just the priests, just the monks, with maybe a couple of high-ranking officers and various secular institutions, maybe a couple of especially rich merchants, but probably not, at least not until, the very late part of the medieval world. Luther is in a world where the printing press is making books more accessible all the time, where it is theoretically possible for every German peasant to have their own Bible, and consequently Luther insists you only need the Bible. In an era when no one is literate, you need somebody from the Catholic Church, a representative who is trained in being able to read, to be able to tell you what the Bible says and explain to you what the Bible means. But Luther is saying you don't need them anymore. You can get your own Bible, you can learn how to read it, and you can come to your own conclusions about it. Sola Scriptura, you do not need the Catholic Church, all you need is your scripture, your Bible. But the other principle he insists upon is sola fides. He does not need all of the ritual, all of the sacraments that the Catholic Church insists upon. You don't necessarily need to be baptized by an authoritative member of the Catholic Church. You don't necessarily need to have last rites performed by an authoritative member of the Catholic Church. You don't necessarily need some Catholic priest to preside over your marriage, or to preside over your confessions, or to preside over any number of other sacraments that take place. All you need is faith. Faith alone is sola fides. So you only need your Bible, sola scriptura. You only need your faith, sola fides. Now, Luther is honestly less dramatic in his interpretation of these two principles than many of the Protestants who follow him will be. The Lutheran Church is considerably more sacrament-oriented than most other Protestant churches. But, that's what he's used to. He doesn't have that much beef with the way Catholics do things, just the hierarchy that causes them to make bad choices. So Luther insists, read your own dang Bibles, come to your own dang conclusions, practice your faith however you see fit, and God will recognize it and God will reward it. But anytime that you bring up a philosophy, a new religious principle that basically says, do your own thing, come to your own conclusions, people will. So John Calvin up in the Netherlands is like, you know what? I really like this Luther guy. He seems to have his head on straight, but why do we need him? I'll just read my own dang Bible and come to my own dang conclusions, and my own dang faith will be recognized by God. So he basically founds his own church with his own books that he writes, the Divine Institutes, and this new Calvinist branch of the Reformation spreads especially throughout Scandinavia and west into England and throughout, in fact, quite a bit of Northern Europe. Now, Calvin's got different ideas than Luther. He has different focuses than Luther, and Calvin, coming from a fairly middle-class background in the Netherlands, a country that is very much organized and devoted to its trade, means that Calvin is a little bit more financially conscious than most. He even has a passage in the Divine Institutes, which I kind of regret, which has something along the lines of, hey, if you happen to be wealthy and you've got a lot of money in your bank account, well, that's just God telling you you're doing a good job. Boo! Yeah, this is very much where this idea that, you can actually be totally wealthy and rich and successful, and, charitable donations are secondary to you seeing the approval from God that, hey, God likes you. This very much kind of starts here and is going to become a very pernicious idea in Christendom in many years to come. But even this is not nearly as selfish or self-serving as what we see from the head of the Anglican Church, our guy King Henry VIII. See, Henry VIII has a problem. He is very married, and he is not having any male heirs, so he's not entirely sure where the whole, future of England is going to lie, and also, he just straight up doesn't like his wife. Let's be perfectly honest, he just doesn't like her. A lot of people are starting to spread rumors that maybe this guy is impotent, which is why he makes sure that his portrait painters always give him a very, very prominent codpiece, as an emblem of his virility. I'm not making this up, I wish I could make this up. But anyway, King Henry VIII needs a divorce and needs to marry someone who's going to provide him with some more kids, and at the moment, the Catholic Pope, who is the only person who could potentially grant him this divorce, is very busy being invaded by Charles V. So King Henry VIII is like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to make my own church, and I'm going to give myself a divorce because I'm going to be the head of my own church, and it's going to be awesome. So King Henry VIII founds the Anglican Church, appoints himself the head of the Anglican Church, gives himself a divorce, and calls it a day. And this is actually the motivation of a lot of political leaders at the time in the Protestant Reformation. A lot of people are looking around and being like, being able to worship God and have everyone think that I'm being a good Christian, but also not giving a bunch of money and land to the church sounds really cool. So a whole bunch of people jump on board with this Protestant Reformation business because, it's financially lucrative. It's advantageous to them. Who wants to hang around with those Catholics anyway? Which is where the Catholics start fighting back with the Counter-Reformation, and, the entirety of Europe starts drawing lines in the sand, so it's like France is super Catholic, Spain is super Catholic, but Germany is super Protestant, and Scandinavia is super Protestant, and England is just a fucking mess, and we'll deal with them when we get to it. But all this to say, there are lots of reasons to become Protestants. Some people are doing them for good reasons, because they honestly believe in what the Protestant Reformation stands for, because they honestly think that the Catholics are bad news and are doing Christianity wrong, sometimes to the point of even calling the Pope the Antichrist, while other people are in it because, hey, this is actually really convenient. I don't want to pay the Catholics any more taxes. This would be great if I could just bail. So, again, when I talk about motivation, this is what I mean. Some people are going to be on board with big changes and political movements and whatever because they actually believe in them, because they actually want these changes, because they think that making the world a better place is a good thing to do. And some people are on it because it's very profitable. And that's just the way of things. It is a constant of history that people are going to jump on board these movements just because they seem to be powerful, just because they seem to be convenient. Honestly, we could have the exact same conversation about that moment when Constantine approved Christianity back in the 4th century, and everyone was like, hey, let's become a Christian priest. And Constantine's like, were you always a Christian priest? They're like, who cares? It's very convenient. So all that to say, yeah, watch for this, because we're going to get it into this sort of discussion consistently throughout this lecture. But with that in mind, the Protestant Reformation very much devolves into war, as you would expect. Catholics versus Protestants, Brits versus French, like all the old, rivalries are stirred up again, and now everybody's fighting each other, and it's honestly one of the most damaging conflicts in the history of Europe. Millions die on a scale that has never been seen before. Whole thing is a hideous tragedy, but we're not going to talk about it. Because instead I want to talk about science. In the 17th century, yes, the 30 Years' War is going on, and it sucks. But at the same time, all of those developments that we saw beginning in the Renaissance, writers, corresponding with each other, talking about nature, talking about science, talking about optics, talking about how, we perceive color and shape and how you can make a three-dimensional painting, very much develops into some people doing what we usually would call science more typically today. We get our guy Galileo, who insists that, he's been carefully and painstakingly documenting his time spent with his telescope looking up at the stars, and he has some pretty controversial things to say about the Earth actually going around the sun, not the sun going around the Earth, which is, enough to scandalize the Catholic Church, which is already really, really sensitive after this whole Protestant Reformation thing. Usually the Catholics can shut these things down, but now that the printing press is in play, it's really difficult to stop ideas from spreading. So when Galileo is like, hey, by the way, I have this other idea that is kind of counter to what you've been teaching forever, they're like, nope, we cannot have this. You will be locked in your house for the rest of your life. But still, Galileo gets his ideas out and kind of wins the day. Francis Bacon is hanging out in Protestant England where he doesn't have to worry about Catholics, so he's just having a lot of fun conducting, quote, scientific experiments, and basically developing this new method of doing knowledge where you, do experiments and then you write about your experiments and then you circulate what you wrote about your experiments, and then other people in other places can, duplicate your experiments, and if everyone is coming to the same conclusion, well, that sounds like it's actually a law then, and maybe we should all believe that this is true about all times and all places. In short, he is one of the main engineers of the scientific method. As much as that was a fairly colloquial way to put it, that was the scientific method in a nutshell. Make your hypothesis, test your hypothesis through experimentation, record your data, share your findings with everybody else, revise your initial hypothesis according to your findings, repeat until you've got something that actually explains the information you found. And the last one that I've got to talk about, because of course I'm a philosopher and you can't not talk about him, is René Descartes. Descartes is the French philosopher who comes up with the brilliant statement, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which is basically to say Descartes changes the way that philosophy is going about its business. Throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, when you encounter philosophers, they're usually talking about how does the world work? Is there a God? Do we have free will? How does cause and effect work? But Descartes recognizes that, hey, you can't really talk about all of these things without getting back to how you interpret the world, how you see the things around you. Whether or not God exists is one thing, but whether or not you can figure out whether God exists is in fact another, and we've got to kind of solve that problem first. This is what we philosophers like to call the epistemological turn, which is just a fancy way of saying that we're not looking at the world anymore, we're looking at how we process the world, which is kind of a theme for the modern world, but honestly not something we're going to get into very much here in the discussion of love and friendship. Just know that Descartes' a big deal, and he is, in fact, a major contributor to science. Because just as Galileo is insisting on the raw data and Bacon is insisting on experimentation, Descartes is insisting on using our senses to get information. That information is, on the one hand, kind of necessarily subjective, but on the other hand, that subjective information can be relied upon, especially when combined with the results and findings of other people around us. So consequently, when we figure out how the world works, maybe we should rely as much as on our eyes and ears as our faculty of reason. Which, again, we'll come back to it. But this scientific revolution really does take off here in the 17th century, and you'll notice that, especially according to this map, which I do love this map, it's just got so much that's informative and helpful, you'll notice that you got a whole bunch of these little orange dots, which are now, major academic centers, and a lot of the little blue, rectangles with a hat on them, which are all important universities. Suddenly everybody has science fever. We're making new publications. We're building observatories. We're building universities and academic centers throughout Europe. Like, everyone is chasing after this new way of getting information by the end of the 17th century. Science is awesome. And these people are sure that science is going to change the world, so they want to be on top of that. So all of these thinkers really are transforming the world in some pretty dramatic ways at this point, inventing new ways of looking at the world, inventing new technologies, all of which are really interesting and important. But, and I do want to emphasize this, there are going to be consequences to this, because as much as the world is changing because of, ideas and philosophy and science and, the transmission of information, all of which is really cool and really interesting and is really going to, change things for us, things are changing politically as well. And I want to give us kind of two little case studies to sort of contrast the ways in which politics are changing here in Europe. And first, the first way that I want to examine is the way of France. Specifically, there's this guy, Louis XIV, who rules for 70 years. From the mid-17th century and well into the 18th century, this guy is just in charge of France. And I want to stress this. Up until this point, we've usually not talked about countries as countries. During the medieval world, talking about France is kind of misleading. First off, it's not France when first we run into it at the end of the fall of Rome. At that point, it's Gaul, the province that the Romans have controlled for many years, but is now overrun by barbarians, and what are we going to do about it? But even into the 11th, 12th centuries, France isn't necessarily unified. It's a bunch of petty little lordlings who are all sort of loosely affiliated under a king, but who often don't actually see eye to eye with that king, all kind of fighting each other for territory, and everyone's just kind of in a state of controlled chaos. By the 16th century, things are starting to calm down. The kings of various nations are starting to exert more power over their subjects. You can really talk about France as France at that point. And honestly, of all the nations, France is probably the first to sort of assert itself as an independent nation, as much as the Brits are pretty close behind them. We'll get there. But here in the 17th century, with the rise of Louis XIV, we take this whole being the king to a whole new level. He asserts that he is the absolute monarch of France, the head of the whole show. And he even does a couple of flexes to make sure that everybody knows it. So, for example, Louis XIV, who is currently reigning in Paris because that's the capital of France, that's where the castles are, that's where everybody has been ruling France for literally centuries at this point. And he's like, you know what? I don't want to live in Paris anymore. I'm going to go out to the country. I'm going to build my own dang palace in the middle of nowhere, and if you all want to hang out with the king and get, your policies passed or have him listen to whatever it is that you're trying to get done, you're going to have to come out with me. So he builds this giant palace in the middle of nowhere, Versailles. And it's all very modern. It's got all these fancy mirrors and windows, and the whole place is fantastic and gorgeous, and also kind of a mess. He hasn't figured out how to heat the place yet. So there are all of these great stories of how Louis XIV was layered in multiple fur coats while just eating dinner because he can't figure out how to heat the Hall of Mirrors yet, but is insisting on eating there anyway as a show of his power and authority. He basically sets up his own little puppet palace in the middle of nowhere and says, all right, come with me if you want to be heard. And all of a sudden, all of these people are paying rent to the king, and they're all, basically, being taxed to just be next to him. He is a major show of power, a major show of influence, and a lot of rulers in Europe are looking at this and being like, wow, that guy knows how to live it up. And you'll notice that way back on that little slide I showed you with all of the academic centers, all those little sunbursts you see are palaces modeled after Versailles. Not only are people really excited about Versailles, but also everybody wants their own Versailles. They all want to show off how rich they are. They all want to show off how powerful they are. They all want to, follow the new way of looking rich and cool, which is basically the one that Louis XIV is showing them. Like, Louis XIV is so dang bold that at one point, he is quoted as saying, "I am the state." Like, there is no government outside of the person of the king. And the guy is pretty effective as leaders go. Like, again, I'm pretty sure he still holds the record for the longest running European monarch. Like, I think Elizabeth II, like the Queen of England, who just died not too long ago, actually came real close to the record, but, like, missed it by a year. Tough luck, Lizzie. But yeah, this guy is famous for being one of the most long-running leaders of, the European world, and for good reason. He was a major power hound and very much sort of created the model of the absolute monarch, the leader of a nation who was basically just ruling utterly and completely over that nation. But by contrast to this, I want to stress all of that rulership, all of that wealth, all of those accomplishments, all of those palaces are at the end of the day built on some pretty heinous activities. Like, France isn't necessarily the obvious candidate for talking about imperialism, but it is certainly one of the obvious candidates. The Dutch, the Spanish, these are sort of like the big imperialist powers leading up to the 17th century, although they are very much going to get beaten out by the French on one hand and the British on the other, who will then create their own empires and their own ridiculously oppressive societies. What I want to stress, though, is that when we are talking about all of these kings and powerful people and scientists and philosophers, when we are talking about great economic changes and inventions, we should mention that all of this is built on the backs of a whole lot of people suffering and dying as a consequence of their greed. Like, you cannot talk about the 16th century and beyond without also talking about the era of colonialism, which is often dressed up to be the age of exploration or something equally ridiculous. This was an era where all of the wealth comes from other places and comes flowing into Europe, where, the wealth of Paris is built on the backs of slaves and African colonies, where, hard, brutal labor is being done by people who are widely considered to be less than human, even though they are perfectly human and are just being mistreated horribly by people who have guns and power and technological advances. This image is a fairly famous one of the conquistadors, Cortez invading the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And it is kind of emblematic of what imperialism is all about. Like, the Aztecs had their own flourishing culture, their own empire, which had its own problems, let's be perfectly honest, but was doing just fine until this dude with all of his armor and horses and guns showed up and started systematically killing every last person in this place. And then turning it into an expedition to find gold, an expedition to find silver, turning it into an opportunity to basically strip the land of all of its valuable metals and ship it back home to Spain to increase the coffers of the Spanish king and queen. This is how the French get rich and powerful. This is how the Dutch get rich and powerful. Like, this is the era of the North Atlantic slave trade, something pioneered by the Dutch and continued by the British and basically everybody else. As much as we are going to talk about the American colonies and their successes and failures, know that all of that is built on the backs of killing the people who are already there, or making them serve you, or basically functionally enslaving them. And in most cases, that slavery is looking even worse than the stuff the Spartans were doing thousands of years ago. It really sucks. Like, it is, in many ways, some of the shittiest history you can encounter in a study of world history. So remember this, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about big ideas and, the 1%, effectively. The people who are benefiting, who are sitting on the top of the pyramid and enjoying all of the advantages of all of this horrible stuff. We are not going to get much opportunity to talk about the people on the bottom of the pyramid at all. Though you'd be surprised who happens to be on the bottom at the end of the day, perhaps. At any rate, I just wanted to, stand out there, recognize that this is the age of emperors and age of empires in many respects. And these empires are usually pretty terrible and would make the Romans look like, they're a bunch of friendly, egalitarian, cartoon characters at the end of the day. But with that in mind, I want to turn our attention to England as the other case study for how to do politics here in the new modern world. Because the story of England is very much directly counter to what's going on in France. You've probably heard stories about Queen Elizabeth, because basically every teacher in New Jersey has to, and for that matter, basically every teacher in the United States has to cover Shakespeare at some point, and in order to cover Shakespeare, you got to cover Queen Elizabeth. But I want to stress that when Queen Elizabeth dies, there's kind of a huge crisis in England. Because Queen Elizabeth, if you didn't notice, didn't have any kids. No heirs, and consequently you gotta jump back up the line and find out who is, her father or grandfather's next inheritor on the line, and the dice apparently come up, oh, it's James the First. Which is especially awkward because James the First is actually James the Third over in Scotland, because he's actually the King of Scotland right now. Which, if you know anything about England and Scotland at any point prior to, the 20th century, it's tense. The Brits do not want some rando Scottish Catholic douchebag coming in and basically calling the shots for the entire country. And all of these Protestants are really upset about it, and all of the Puritans basically, flee the country and come over to the New World. Yeah, that's where, American colonies come from, like the Jamestown colony and the Plymouth colony. If you've heard anything about pilgrims, those are basically a bunch of religious fanatics who freak out because they don't want to be ruled by a Catholic, which... there's some justification to that, but not nearly as much as they think there is. Mostly it's just, panicky nonsense, which honestly kind of, sets the stage for a lot of American Christianity. But I digress. At any rate, James I is not especially popular, but he is very successful. He's a very capable leader, makes a lot of really cool concessions, and actually makes England pretty chill for the term of his reign. One of his big moves, which actually is kind of relevant for our discussion, is he comes up with the first real official translation of the English Bible, the King James Version. Get it? It's named after him. Yeah, so the King James Version is literally commissioned by him to basically make Protestants happy, and, as much as the Protestants are still going to whine about it, at the end of the day, it does a pretty good job. But his kids aren't nearly as successful as he is in the whole, okay, we're going to run the country and, divide our loyalties between our Catholic heritage and our Protestant, Protestant, civilians and citizens. So when his son, Charles I, comes to power, he basically just, sits on the throne and whines and dines and, has sex with lots of women, and people are like, wow, that guy's the worst. We should totally do something about this. So Parliament, which has to be a thing thanks to the Magna Carta, if I'm not mistaken, they basically say, hey, we're not going to, listen to you anymore. We're not going to pay attention to what you have to say. And the king's like, you can't do that. I'm the king. And they're like, well, you suck, and we hate you. So we're going to go to war now. And they do. They go to war. There's this huge war in the middle of the 17th century, and the king is fighting against the parliamentary forces, and, each has, different corners of England that they're all sort of in charge of, and who are all loyal to them. And the whole thing is a giant freaking mess. And then finally, the parliament gets the better of the king, and they capture him. They capture the king of the country. And they stick him in a jail cell, and they're like, what do we do with him? And the other guy's like, I don't know, what do you think we should do with him? How do we deal with this fact that we've captured our own king? We started this whole fight because we were really grumpy with him, and now what do we do? So they execute him. What else are you going to do? They just behead him. They kill him. And everything goes nuts. The army, turns against them, and finally they raise up, this big army general, Cromwell, to, take over the whole country, and now Parliament is fighting against Cromwell, and oh my gosh, what is even happening? And finally the whole thing is, put to rest, and they get rid of Cromwell, and they even, dig him up and behead him posthumously at one point. It's hilarious. I love the British. But at any rate, we finally get back to the original line. Okay, so we're going to have, Charles II in charge now. See what I did there? And then James II, who everybody also hates, at which point the Brits are just like, you know what, forget it. We're just going to tell him he's not the king anymore, and we're going to bring some other king over from the Netherlands, and it's just going to be fine. And they do. James II is told in the middle of the night, okay, you're not king anymore. And he's like, but I'm the king. And they're like, get out of our country. And he's like, all right, fine. And he, sails over to Ireland and then escapes to the mainland Europe and, tries to start a revolution. And the whole thing is really tragic. The Scots are very disappointed about the whole Battle of Culloden thing. At any rate, though, the Brits are very cool with their new, totally legitimate Dutch king. And they're basically now happy, so how do we justify this? Which is where John Locke comes in. John Locke is a British philosopher in the late 17th century. You've probably heard about him because everybody likes to talk about him in, American history textbooks where it's like, John Locke was the founder of democracy, and he was the inspiration for the American Constitution. All right, fine, we'll get there. But right now I want to look at John Locke as John Locke, because once again we are in a territory where it's like, okay, so why are we doing what we are doing? Like, did we in fact get rid of our king because we thought that it was better to, make the world a better, more egalitarian, more democratic place? Or is it just because Parliament really hated him and the Protestants were really grumpy with the Catholic king and consequently they didn't want to tolerate his nonsense anymore? John Locke writes philosophy to kind of retroactively justify what has gone down with the whole British Civil War thing. He writes these essays, the two treatises of government, where he basically lays down all of your American history textbook stuff. That actually the king rules at the behest of the people. That actually everybody is a blank slate and nobody is either good or evil when they are born, despite what you may have heard from various Catholic authorities. And actually, if a person doesn't want their king to be king anymore, then the people have the right to, chuck him out and get a new king from Holland if they want. Just for example, as a hypothetical. So Locke kind of goes out of his way in the late 18th century or late 17th century to say, hey, the whole British Civil War thing, totally legitimate. God is not upset with them because it was entirely up to them whether or not they wanted their king to, continue to be king or not. And the Glorious Revolution, the one where we get William and Mary to come over from Holland and just take over the country, that was totally also legitimate because, the people spoke. And the people said, we don't want Charles II, we won't want James II, we want this dude. So everything is legitimate and everything is on the up and up, and here is my carefully reasoned argument for why we were totally okay doing the thing that we already did. Which means that we are dealing with two very different views of government right now. One where Louis XIV says, I am the state, and effectively rules as a god, completely unchallenged with divine authority. And one where now there are a whole bunch of people talking about, hey, actually people decide who rules them, and it is entirely up to them, and maybe kings don't have any God-given power whatsoever. Now, in the middle of all this, we end up with the Europe we're going to be talking about for the foreseeable future. Because with the writing of the two treatises of government and with the reign of Louis XIV, we finally do enter the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is the period that I really do want to talk about here. The Enlightenment is the era that I am most interested in concentrating on for the purpose of this particular lecture, and the one that I am going to be sort of examining and reevaluating as we go forward in this class and talk about, Romanticism and such. And you'll notice that at this point the map of Europe is starting to look like, the map of Europe. We got Spain, we got Portugal, we got France. Italy is kind of a mess, but it is mostly Italy-ish. And over here we've got England and Ireland, and, we've got, Poland-ish, and well, I don't know what's going on down there, and maybe some Scandinavian countries that we are familiar with. If you have seen a current map of Europe, it's going to start to look fairly familiar to the one that we are seeing here. Now, admittedly, Germany's still a mess. Again, the Holy Roman Empire very much had its back broken during that 30 Years' War business, both, philosophically and also politically, but what are you going to do? We also have, hey, there's Russia. Remember Russia? We'll come back to Russia. At any rate, the European world is starting to look the way the European world is going to for the foreseeable future. National lines have been drawn, and the countries that have come to be are going to be the countries that remain to this day in many cases. There are still some boundaries to talk about and some Habsburgs to kill, but we'll get there, don't you worry. But right now, in the 18th century, we now have a new big idea floating around Europe. Now that John Locke has said, hey, actually people decide who their leaders are, there is some pretty big discussion of, hey, what if we use all those scientific principles that everyone is really excited about? Descartes, Galileo, Isaac Newton, those guys, they came up with some really good ideas for how to do knowledge. So what if we take science and apply it to everything? Everything. We'll apply it to the human mind, we'll apply it to, how to rule a country, we'll apply it to morality, we'll apply it to religion. What if we take science and make it do everything? Which brings us to the Enlightenment. This is why the Enlightenment is frequently called the Age of Reason. And that's what you should remember going forward. Like, as we discuss the Enlightenment, remember, this is the age of reason. This is where all of the philosophers and all of the politicians and all of the thinkers and all of the leaders are talking about rationality as though it is going to solve all of our problems. Like, we're going to take our science and we're going to make it solve everything. So with that in mind, let's look at what's going down, how science and this sort of hyper-rational view of the world is going to shake out. And the first thing we definitely need to talk about is the Industrial Revolution. Here in the 18th century, now that science is a thing, science is developing new technologies, and these technologies are in fact radically changing the face of Europe. Now, I know I've said radically changing the face of Europe like quite a few times at this point, or something fairly similar to it, but this time I mean it for reals. Because on the one hand, the dissemination of information with the printing press is a big deal. It means that all of a sudden scientists and philosophers and scholars and artists can all communicate with each other. This is a huge game changer, but at the same time, we've moved the bar from like a maybe 2% literacy rate in Europe to like a 12% literacy rate in Europe. Like, we are, in fact, getting more and more people. Maybe at this point we're at, like, 30, 40, maybe even 50% literacy. But broadly speaking, like, there's a good half of Europe that hasn't figured out that the Renaissance has happened yet. The average poor person who has been, like, on the same peasant farm, paying rent to the same landlord for literally centuries, effectively, didn't notice that the Renaissance happened. Didn't notice that the Protestant Reformation happened in some cases, except insofar as maybe somebody came up and told them, hey, you believe this now, and they're like, oh, okay. But broadly speaking, when the Industrial Revolution goes down, everything really does change for them. Like, this one I cannot overstate. This one your, high school teachers could not overstate. This really is a huge deal. The technology introduced through the Industrial Revolution radically changes the way that everybody's lives in Europe work. And some of that is for the better, and some of that is for the worse. It is, again, fairly complicated. We could definitely have a 2 stories of the Industrial Revolution conversation, where it's like, here is story 1, where, it is the beginning of progress and scientific achievement and, the march of progress and all of us getting more and more civilized and more accomplished as the days go on. That's story 1. Whereas story 2 is, this introduces new capitalist forms of, exploitation, and now the worker is, like, divorced from their means of production, and all of a sudden, like, workers' lives are being dramatically, like, ruined and destroyed, and the average person in Europe is completely alienated from all of their livelihood and all of their homelands and everything that has gone for hundreds of years beforehand. Both of these stories are legitimately true about the Industrial Revolution in some sense. If anything, I'm more suspicious of the first, but what are you going to do? But what I want to stress is the family life here, more than the 2 stories approach. Because this is where the family really does change. Like, I'm not going to get into the details of individual nations' attitudes on divorce or, like, women's liberation, as much as that might be relevant to our discussion, and as much as I've done that in the past. Again, Europe is a kind of changing place, and Europe now has multiple different laws across the whole place. Like, we could talk about, all right, this is what the British family looks like, and this is what the French family looks like, and this is what the German family looks like, and this is what the Spanish family looks like. But broadly speaking, they're all going to look fairly similar, and the bigger change is happening because of the Industrial Revolution. Because prior to the Industrial Revolution, your average peasant family is going to look something like this. Everybody is pitching in. We all live in the same house. We all live on the same farm. We have lived in this house, on this farm, for literally as long as our family has existed. And everybody contributes to the work that is done in the household. Some people are going to be, like taking care of the children or making food or, stitching together cloth for clothes, while other people are like outside farming the land, tilling and planting and harvesting. But everyone is contributing to the success of the family, and the percentage that this family is going to pay to their landlords, to the king, to whoever, is not going to necessarily jeopardize their livelihood too terribly badly. The downside of this whole format, like, as much as it looks idyllic and peaceful and, like, hey, family is good. This is all true. But I also don't want to downplay the fact that this is very subject to, does the land make food for you? You get one good blight or one good famine and it wipes out half the family, like no problem. If all of a sudden all the livestock die out because of sickness or because it got too cold this winter, well, that's it for the family. Like, it is a precarious existence, as much as it seems kind of awesome in many ways looking back at it. But what I want to stress about the new industrial way of life is that it really very much is not awesome. As much as the Industrial Revolution brings us all new products, like instead of mom and dad stitching their own clothes together and darning their own socks by firelight as, after the, sun has gone down and it's become impossible to work outside, at the same time, those new, factory-made clothes are not making up for the fact that the entire family had to, leave their home and go to the city where they're working in an awful factory all the time. The circumstances surrounding this move are dramatic and earth-shaking for most of the, lower-class people in Europe at this time. Farmers just can't keep farming, is what it comes down to. It's not financially practicable anymore. There are new technologies, tractors, and machinery that allow people to farm much more effectively and much faster, and most of these peasant families can't afford those. So consequently, all one, entrepreneuring, middle-class tradesman needs to do is buy some farmland, buy some machinery, and he can outperform the rest of the community, overnight. Which effectively puts those families out of business, which means now they're looking for work in factories in the big cities, which happily, are really eager to provide. They want to hire as many dang people as possible and get as many people into the door working to, perform the same menial tasks over and over again all day long. But I gotta stress, this is factories before OSHA. This is factories before labor protections. This is factories before labor unions. At the early part of the Industrial Revolution, these things do not exist, and while we're getting there, it'll be a little while before we see them properly developed. Which means, without any of these protections, the environment that we're working in is truly awful. If you were working in a textile mill, you can bet that there's, fluff and cotton floating in the air, making it difficult to breathe. You can bet that there are these giant machines with giant flywheels not properly closed or properly protected, and so people are getting, their hands or arms caught in the machinery and then torn off by the incredible power of these machines. And these people who are now maimed as a result of the machinery or the accidents, they are just out of luck. There's no, severance pay, there's no disability, they're just fired on the spot, and good luck finding a way to make money now that you have, one arm or one leg or whatever the case may be. Likewise, all these families are going to be crammed in these tiny little bunkhouses, often provided by the factory owner at the cheapest possible price possible. These people are going to be working literally 12 to 16-hour days or worse, and that includes women, children, basically anyone who has a spare pair of hands. And that assumes that your family stays together. In more and more cases, the families are being split apart. Some people are still trying to work the farm while their kids are going off into the city in order to make money because the farm isn't successful anymore. And that means that they are no longer able to afford to, feed themselves or their family. The cities themselves are exploding in size. We're going from cities of several thousand or tens of thousands to cities of millions large. By the 19th century, there are multiple cities throughout Europe that are millions of people in size, which brings all kinds of new problems with infrastructure and hygiene and sewage. Again, it is a pretty horrible state of affairs for most people throughout the Industrial Revolution. I want to stress, all of this represents at the very least a dramatic change. At the very most, a complete shift in livelihood. And talking about family and marriage in this context seems kind of ridiculous, honestly. The highbrow rich folks are in fact having elaborate, courtship dances and elaborate methods of marrying off their daughters or sons. And the transmission of money is also kind of a big deal during this process. But what I want to stress is that for most families during the Industrial Revolution, it's catch as catch can. you will find happiness wherever you can, because, let's be honest, there's not a whole lot to go around. So with that in mind, again, the split between rich and poor is pretty dang dramatic here. And again, we're going to be focusing on the rich, so remember, not only are we exploiting all of those people overseas in different countries, all those slaves and all those indigenous peoples whose lives are being utterly destroyed by imperialism, we are also destroying all of the lives of the poor class in Europe. But it doesn't change the fact that we are still going to be talking about philosophers and scholars and leaders and giant political movements, which means we're still going to be focused on rich people, weird and gross as that may sound. Don't worry, the Romantics will bring us back, but here in the Enlightenment, poor people don't exist, just pretend that they're not there, and we will move on with our discussion. So, in this era, this is also an era of dramatic and ostentatious wealth. Remember Versailles and the giant palace that Louis XIV built to prove that he could? This is going to be the model for many a palace and many a ostentatious display of wealth throughout Europe. All those factory owners are making absolute bank, mistreating their citizens and sticking them in bunkhouses and congregating them together under awful conditions. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, there are a whole bunch of people in awful conditions, isn't this a recipe for disaster? Shh, wait, we're getting there. Like, don't spoil it for everyone who hasn't figured out the ending yet. But broadly speaking, yes, ostentatious displays of wealth are the way that rich people deal with things. We're going to pretend like all those poor people do not exist, and we're going to celebrate how awesome and rich we are. But I gotta stress that even the artists are getting a little stressed and tired of this nonsense. Many a scholar, many a philosopher, many a socialite, many a politician has pointed out that this is actually super hypocritical, and these people are awful. So as much as the Rococo movement is becoming the new way of displaying all of your ostentatious wealth, we've got plenty of satirists sort of poking fun at rich people, usually for the entertainment of other rich people, but also recognizing that maybe rich people are not as awesome and cool as they make themselves out to be. Remember, we've got these two different modes of government. Louis XIV's French model, where, like, rich people are awesome and perfect and all of the time, and now the English model, where, like, actually rich people are only serving the will of the poor people. Folks like Hogarth, the artist who painted this particular painting, are very much in the more democratic camp. And I want to stress that that means that art, literature, philosophy are going to, on the one hand, be motivated by rich people, no surprise there, but on the other hand, there is a democratic movement here. Art is becoming less of a rich person thing, which is good news for us. So here in Marriage à la Mode, which is itself like a giant joke, hey, it's, marriage because marriage is fun and the thing to do, you've got, like, these women who are clearly, like, the married person. This is the wife, this is the husband. But you notice, like, this dude is clearly making eyes at her and even, like, passing her notes, which she is apparently pretty ready to take. The kid in the corner is the one who has the real truth of it. Like, as much as this might be a racist caricature, it's also fairly true for the time. But you'll notice that he's pointing the horns on this thing. Like, oh, it's a cuckold joke. Like, I know that, wearing horns is, like, code for that person is, his wife is sleeping with another man. You'll also notice that all the rich people here just look ridiculous. Like, this dude is just sitting there in curlers. This dude is, like, singing, but I don't know, just look at his face. Like, as much as this is, hey, rich people doing rich people things, they look ridiculous in doing so. And you'll notice that this is kind of a trend here in the 18th century. As much as this is an era of rationality, you'll notice that rationality extends to all classes, if not all races, just yet. We'll get there. Or maybe not. There is a new artistic movement, a new philosophical movement, a new ideological movement afoot. One that is resistant to the influence of the richer classes, and is instead very willing to embrace classical motifs, classical ideas, in an effort to point to the classical priorities of citizenship, the republic, forms of government that are, at least in theory, more egalitarian. Now, admittedly, we've studied the Greeks and the Romans. We know that those guys were not egalitarian. The Greek citizens and the demos included only rich landowning, like, Greek people. The citizens of Rome were, at the end of the day, also just rich Romans and were, existing on the backs of a whole bunch of suffering and tyranny and so on and so forth. But it doesn't change the fact that the old images are sort of representative of what people, like average people, want and, how to treat them well. So a whole bunch of artists, a whole bunch of thinkers, a whole bunch of philosophers are looking back to the classical writers, to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, for inspiration for their Locke-esque attacks on organized government the way that it is organized today. Just as Locke was saying that the king rules at the will of the people, increasingly more and more people are listening to that kind of thinking and saying, hey, this is our symbol. Socrates, the Renaissance, these are the images, the symbols of our new democratically organized revolution against the monarchs and, overblown greedy jerks who are taking over the world. And this also goes along with the way that new art forms are being developed. Like, up until this point, again, art is very much a rich person thing. Paintings go to museums where rich people pay to look at them, or better yet, rich people buy these paintings and then show them off to their rich friends. If you want to go to the opera, it's going to be real expensive to get in. And while there are vaudeville shows and other sort of low-class entertainments, this is not what rich people do or are entertained by. But now that literacy is really through the roof, like we've got 50-60% literacy now, if not higher, we can actually make books real cheap, and everyone can enjoy them. And this brings about a sort of new democratic revolution in art. The 18th century is a fascinating era in sort of the development of the novel. Like, I'd love to, teach a class someday on just the 18th century novel, especially like the 18th century British novel, because they're just fun. Like, the 19th century novels can frequently get boring and tedious, but I just, like, every time I read an 18th century novel, I'm just surprised and excited about what I find there. And one of the things you'll notice about the 18th century novel is that oftentimes it's just fun to read. Like, Robinson Crusoe. The guy who, gets stranded on an island and has to survive there for, a whole long time. That's actually widely considered the first European novel ever written. Because again, since novels were written to anyone who could read, that meant that poor people who were literate and middle-class people and rich people were all reading them. And so you didn't necessarily write them on highbrow ideas like, oh, this is some rich person who has fallen in love and tragically cannot be with his beloved. Like, nobody cares. But adventure dude goes to island and has to survive? That's awesome! Like, we've riffed on that story I don't even know how many times at this point. So this art form, as art form, frequently is targeted towards otherwise people who would not be able to appreciate art. People who historically did not do art in some respect. So you get literature that is exciting and adventurous, or you get literature that is specifically about the lower classes, even if it is a little bit satirical in the process. You get writers talking about social problems in these novels and reflecting the struggles of especially poor people. As much as this is an age where rich people can afford to ignore the poor people like never before, this is also an age where increasingly rich people are interested in the problems of poor people because poor people are actually getting their voices heard. Isn't that strange? So we have this kind of division between the democratic principles and the sort of highfalutin rich person principles, and this is naturally going to give us conflict. Now, as philosophers are listening to these novels and paying attention to the plight of the underclasses, they are increasingly following the Lockean model of actually rulers rule with the permission or at the behest of the people who are ruled. And there is no one who is more influential on that front than our guy Rousseau. Now, when we talk about Rousseau as like a writer about love and friendship, we're going to have a whole bunch of other things to say about him, and it's going to be interesting. But broadly speaking, here in the 18th century, probably the most influential thing that he wrote was less a matter of his social writings and more a matter of his political writings. The Social Contract. This basically outlines a kind of even more codified idea of what Locke is kicking around, where he's like, yeah, it was totally okay that we kicked out our own king. He is laying out that actually all governments are a product of the social contract. That all of us agree to let people rule us for our own good. And consequently, any king, any ruler, any government can be undone or remade if the people want it so. And it's this guy who all of the founding fathers of the Constitution, our Thomas Jeffersons and our Ben Franklins and our John Adamses, are listening to and reading about as they are thinking about the situation over here in the American colonies. However, as much as there is all this discussion about, like, hey, people get to decide what the world looks like, and we all get to decide what our government looks like, we've also got quite a few thinkers who are, I hesitate to say more conservative, looking at the face of David Hume, but who are thinking about this from a different direction. Again, if the whole thing with Descartes is that, hey, we're going to do this epistemological turn, we're going to look at how we process the world and we have to interrogate ourselves before we can figure out what's going on with the world, Hume very much questions all of this. Hume is a famous philosophical skeptic, like the skeptics of old. In fact, he frequently refers to them throughout his work. He's also one of the philosophers that I'm honestly more familiar with than many of the others that we've talked about in this class so far, so all the more reason for me to want to bring him up. But Hume questions the whole business of science, the whole business of understanding, the whole business of, rights and knowledge, and basically tells us, hey, we can't know anything, actually. All of this is pure rational speculation. It is all of us flattering ourselves and thinking that our thoughts are more meaningful than just, brain farts. It is all, at the end of the day, just a crapshoot, and we are doing the best we can with what we've got, and that's probably for the best, but still, don't get high on your own rationality. Again, if the Enlightenment is the age of reason, Hume is the great critic of the age of reason. Hume basically tells us reason isn't a thing at the end of the day. That all of the stuff that you call reasoning, all of the stuff that you say are necessary causes and effects, are at the end of the day mere accidents. That all of your supposed scientific laws are at the end of the day just fairly informed observations about the world, but that could change at any moment if, in fact, the laws of the world changed. Something that we couldn't possibly anticipate or know about or understand. And against this wild skepticism, we get probably the greatest thinker of the entire Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. Now again, Kant we're going to read, but it's going to be in a radically different context. What I have to stress about Kant is that, as philosophers go, in the entire history of philosophy, if, as I've said before, Plato is considered the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and some people have said that, every philosopher ever since Plato is just writing a series of footnotes to Plato, the one possible exception, the one also awesome philosopher who could theoretically be as important as Plato in his own right, at the very least, the most serious competitor to Plato's dominance as the greatest philosopher ever lived, is probably this guy. I definitely have this one textbook that I've been using for my intro to philosophy classes since I don't even want to think about it. It's something like 1,600 pages of just reading after reading after reading from various philosophers. And I swear something like 250 pages are straight up just Plato. The first 250 pages of the book are just Platonic dialogues. It's like the Republic and the Meno and so on and so forth. If you look at the table of contents and figure out who is the next person with the most number of pages, it is definitely Immanuel Kant. Aristotle's got a pretty decent showing. I want to say that there's 150 pages of the Nicomachean Ethics and the Physics and other fun stuff like that. But Kant shows up with the Critique of Pure Reason, and it's and it's over. This guy writes a lot. His writings are incredibly influential. Everyone's going to be talking about him for the rest of philosophical history. It is frequently said that even if no matter what you write, no matter what you have to say, no matter what philosophical idea you have to present, you will have to contend with Kant at some point. Because Kant is absolutely driven nuts by Hume. He reads Hume and he, a fire starts burning in him. He even describes it as such. He's he woke me from my dogmatic slumber. I had believed the philosophers, and then Hume came along, questioned everything, and I said to myself, I've got to be able to answer this guy. And he comes up with one heck of an answer. He argues that essentially all of our reason is rooted in universal categories, that we all process space and time in roughly the same ways, even if we do have different eyes, different perspectives, different perceptive qualities. At the end of the day, we still process it through basic universal categories of the understanding, and using our synthetic unity of the apperception, which is basically we process that into actual universal laws that actually hold and that actually are in fact binding and descriptive about the world around us. But more than that, Kant sees this rationality, this doubling down on scientific truth, as leading us to a perfect world. Like, as much as nobody reads his political writings nearly as much as they read his epistemological or moral ones, Kant actually assumes that the world is on its way to utopia, that we're actually right around the corner, thank you very much. In multiple essays, he stresses that, like, all we need is to, reorganize government into republics, and if we then, like, bring about, transparency of the ruling bodies to everybody else, we will not only have, like, these perfect republican governments, but we will have a utopian society, and we can banish warfare and fighting and conflict permanently from the world. And he even is saying things like, and that'll probably be like, 50 years maybe on the outside. Kant believes that utopia is not just possible, but that it's right around the corner. And that if we use our rational capacities, if we apply our reason, our understanding of science to the world, we can solve human problems, all of them, and make this place a truly wonderful place to live. And if that doesn't sound familiar, maybe you should have been listening to your American history classes a little bit more closely. Because this is basically the same principle that the founders of the Constitution come up with as they are writing the Constitution. Now, I'm not saying that they're successful. We've actually got a lot to talk about as far as, how America fits into this whole business. But as far as here is, this 100 years of people talking about how to perfect government, how to use science to solve various moral and political problems, the Constitution is kind of the perfect embodiment of this line of reasoning. If the age of reason told us that if we just abandoned all of our superstitions and followed rationality, we could bring about a perfect government, the Constitution is the first experiment, the first test to demonstrate that this was the case. Following Rousseau's social contract, following Locke and his 2 treatises of government, following all of the assumptions that actually kings only rule at the behest of the people, and following the optimism of folks like Kant, who are saying things like, hey, utopia is around the corner, the Americans kick out the British, and they very much create their new government from scratch, based entirely on rational principles. We are going to, balance the different arms of government against one another, and therefore pit people's selfishness against each other, and come out with a system that ultimately produces truth, reason, goodness, and decency. And, we're getting close to, 250, 300 years later, and I'm not entirely sure we're all 100% convinced that this project worked, that this experiment was successful. If anything, we might be hitting the sort of the expiration date on this particular document. At least I've find that poking around the internet, there are a lot of people who are pretty convinced that the expiration date is about to be hit. And there are quite a few people who seem pretty committed to making sure that we hit that expiration date. Apparently 250 years is just when we're going to stop this whole project. But at any rate, what I want to stress is this is Enlightenment thinking at its core. This is the assumption that all people are created equal, that they can, govern themselves rationally if they put aside their biases and assumptions. On paper, this sounds really good. And you'll notice that the art and the style of American government very much embodies that same neoclassical art and style. That it is founded on Renaissance principles, that it's all white columns and, wood painted to look like marble. It is an effort to sort of recapture the glory days of ancient Rome and reinstitute the Senate and the Republic. This is very much what so much of American government aspires to do, and this is very much meant to be a symbol of democracy at work. To the point that we don't even think about it. We assume this, that when we see a big white building with columns like this, we're like, okay, that's a government building. It represents democracy at work. But I want to stress, just as we talked about, there are 2 stories of the Protestant Reformation, just as there are, there's a hidden dark side to imperialism, it's definitely more complicated than that. And we could just as easily be talking about 2 stories of the American government here. And many people are. Because at the end of the day, yes, the Constitution is an embodiment of Enlightenment principles. But when Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence, we believe that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that seems to be extended only to men, as the text would suggest, but also only to some men. The Constitution makes specific accommodations saying that, oh yeah, by the way, slavery is still going to be a thing. And for that matter, we're even going to, like, kowtow to the slave owners in the Deep South by saying that their slaves count as voters even when they're not voters. Like, only a percentage of a voter. Like, let's not be ridiculous. But we are going to, like, let Southerners have more votes because there are, in fact, more people. So, I guess a black person counts as what, like 60% of a person, maybe? 3/5 of a person? That sounds right. All this to say that as much as the Constitution is supposedly this celebration of democracy, this new era in government, this new attempt to process the world through a truly rational means, that rationality only extends so far. People's prejudices, their biases, their racism, it is still so thoroughly entrenched that it doesn't strike them as odd that there's just a whole bunch of white people agreeing to, like, let white people run the country for, however long it might be before this document hits its expiration date. It doesn't bother them that, the people who were rich before the American Revolution turn out to be rich afterwards as well. It doesn't bother them that there are tons of poor people working in factories, suffering under their, inhumane working conditions. And it doesn't bother them that they might have to kill however many Native Americans or displace them from their lands in order to make this government a reality. The truth is, yes, it is an Enlightenment principle, and it is the triumph of the Enlightenment age. This is the great accomplishment that all of the Enlightenment has been building up to. But that is both in the good ways and in the bad ways. It represents the pinnacle of Enlightenment rationality and the pinnacle of Enlightenment blindedness. The myopia that causes people to see only certain other people as people and the rest of them as subhuman in some respect. So with respect to the discussion of love and friendship, yes, a lot is going to change as a consequence of the Enlightenment, but a lot is going to stay the same. As much as the American Constitution guarantees a new era of, democracy and egalitarianism, it's still not going to change the fact that for women, there are not going to be a whole lot of liberations happening in the near future. That it's going to be well over 100 years before any of them get the right to vote in this country. That economic independence is possibly better here for women than in other places, but it depends on which other places, and it depends on what you mean by better. There are a ton of caveats here. And love, as we understand it, is again being processed through that stoic mode, as we'll see through both the work of Rousseau and through Mary Wollstonecraft, who is going to have some words about this whole, organization of government without including women in the discussion business. All of which we can look forward to talking about soon. But here at the end of the Enlightenment, what I wanted to show you, I hope that I have. That here is a world that is rooted in its hypocrisies, but also has a strong conviction in the triumph of rationality over those hypocrisies. That recognizes that humans suck, but are willing to at least experiment with the idea of using humans' crappiness against one another in order to create something good. It is an age of great idealism, and yet an age of great hypocrisy, as many idealistic ages tend to be. So, all this suggests that we are, on the one hand, at the height of a certain kind of European civilization, but that it is also extremely treacherous. That things are about to change, and change dramatically and violently. The American Revolution is widely seen as being sort of this, again, high-water mark in Enlightenment politics, but it is a very civilized war by comparison to what's coming next. And I want to stress that. We talk about the American Revolution as though it is this full-stop heroic era in American history. That's not true, for one thing, but that is the way the story tends to be told. And I want to stress that, on the one hand, yes, we can question that, for sure, and should. But on the other hand, the circumstances are going to make it abundantly clear that there is more going on here than just, hooray, revolutions are good, let's all have a revolution. Because when the French try it, it's going to look very different. But that's a conversation for our next discussion. For now, we are going to move on to first looking at some of the Enlightenment philosophy that we've talked about. Again, we're going to look at Rousseau and contrast his thinking with the work of Mary Wollstonecraft, look at how both of them understand especially the role of women and the role of love in their various philosophical systems. But we are very much going to move on from there to a discussion of Romanticism. And Romanticism is very much the new big movement that's going to absolutely try and take down the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about that in some pretty great detail in the time to come. I look forward to talking about it with you soon.